Hey guys, tonight we're going somewhere that smells vaguely of patchouli, sounds like a Jefferson Airplane record playing from inside a commune kitchen, and feels deeply confusing to anyone who has ever had a job, a haircut, or a stable relationship with furniture. Tonight we're talking about LSD, and how it somehow managed to both create the hippie movement and absolutely destroy it, often at the exact same time. It's the story of a chemical compound that accidentally rewired an entire generation's brain, convinced 1 million young Americans that they could fix the world with flowers and vibes, and then watch that dream dissolve into paranoia, bad trips, and the 6 o'clock news. Before you drift off, a huge thank you to the viewer who suggested this one. You know who you are, and honestly this topic has been sitting in the suggestions for a while waiting for its moment, and it felt like exactly the right kind of slow burn history to settle into tonight. Your ideas genuinely shape what this channel becomes, so thank you sincerely. If you enjoy what I do here, please like the video and subscribe, but only if you actually want to. No pressure, no guilt trip, just genuine appreciation if you do. Drop a comment telling me where you're listening from and what time it is for you. And if you're a Spotify person, the channel is now there too, link in the description, easy to find, great for falling asleep without staring at a screen. Now, dim the lights, put on a fan if you've got one, pull that blanket up, get comfortable in whatever way comfortable means for you. Let's pause for a second. Have you ever wondered what it actually felt like the first time someone took LSD and genuinely believed they had unlocked the universe? What were the parties like when the whole neighbourhood showed up and no one was entirely sure what was in the punch? Could you have survived a week in a commune where the chores were optional, the philosophy was mandatory, and someone's always playing a 12-minute guitar solo at 3 a.m? What happens when an entire counterculture built on peace and love starts eating itself from the inside? Was it the government that brought it all crashing down? Or did the movement do a pretty thorough job of that all on its own? And what exactly is the connection between a Swiss chemist, a dead rock star, and the reason your aunt still talks about 1967 like it was the last time anything mattered? Congratulations, you've just woken up in San Francisco. The year is 1967. Your shoes are somewhere in Golden Gate Park. There's a stranger offering you something from a sugar cube, and a man in face paint is handing you a flower and telling you the revolution starts now. Good luck. Let's start at the very beginning, which in this case is a laboratory in Basel, Switzerland in 1938, where a chemist named Albert Hofmann was not trying to start a counterculture revolution. He was not trying to expand anyone's consciousness or rearrange the American suburbs. He was doing what chemists do, quietly synthesizing compounds from ergot fungus, looking for something that might help with respiratory issues, trying, essentially, to make a better breathing pill. He accidentally made history instead. Hofmann set his new compound aside, forgot about it for 5 years, then came back to it in 1943, at which point he somehow absorbed a tiny amount through his fingertips, got on his bicycle, and experienced the world's first LSD trip while cycling home through the streets of Basel. His notes from that afternoon describe colours that breathed, walls that moved, and a general sense that the universe had decided to introduce itself personally. He was not, it should be noted, prepared for any of this. The compound was lysergic acid diethylamide, LSD-25 to be precise. The 25th in a series of ergot derivatives Hofmann had been methodically working through. There was nothing about its chemical structure that announced itself as extraordinary. It looked, on paper, like a reasonably interesting molecule and not much more. But something about it pulled at Hofmann's attention when he revisited it that April afternoon, and the accidental skin absorption that followed sent him home on his bicycle, experiencing what he later described as an uninterrupted stream of fantastic images, extraordinary shapes with intense kaleidoscopic play of colours. His wife helped him inside. He lay on his couch and asked a neighbour for milk, believing, in the grip of the experience, that he had been poisoned. The neighbour, in his altered perception, appeared as a malevolent witch. The furniture threatened him. The room spun, and then, gradually the terror softened, and what replaced it was something Hoffman spent the rest of his long life. He died in 2008 at 102 years old, trying to describe accurately. He called it a deep, deep happiness, a sense of the world restored to itself. 3 days later, on the 19th of April 1943, a date now celebrated in psychedelic circles as Bicycle Day, Hoffman deliberately took what he calculated to be a threshold dose of LSD 25 and repeated the experiment under controlled conditions. He took 250 micrograms, which is, as it turned out, roughly 2.5 times what most modern users would consider a full dose. The ride home that followed was considerably more intense than the first. Think about that for a moment. You're a Swiss chemist in wartime Europe. You have just accidentally discovered a compound so potent that an amount invisible to the naked eye can completely reorganize the human mind. Your options are to report this to your employer, document it carefully, and proceed with scientific rigor. Hoffman did all of these things. He was a serious man. But he also described that afternoon with a kind of wonder he never fully abandoned, the sense of having stumbled through a door that most people never knew existed. Sandoz Pharmaceuticals, Hoffman's employer, recognized the potential and began distributing LSD to researchers under the name Delicid in 1947. The brochure that accompanied it described potential uses in psychotherapy and as a tool for physicians to experience the subjective state of psychosis. It was available legally by prescription for the next 2 decades. Hoffman had meant to make a better breathing pill. Instead, he had handed the 20th century something it had absolutely no idea what to do with. Before LSD was a festival staple or a government problem, it was a pharmaceutical product sold under the brand name Delicid, packaged in neat little vials and shipped to psychiatrists across Europe and North America with a very serious medical brochure attached. This was the 1950s, and the scientific community was genuinely excited. Researchers believed LSD might be the key to understanding and treating schizophrenia, severe depression, alcoholism, and a range of anxiety disorders. Famous figures in psychiatry were using it in clinical settings with remarkable results. Alcoholics who had failed every other treatment were reporting permanent recovery after a single supervised session. Terminally ill patients were finding peace. Therapists were cautiously describing it as the most powerful tool they had ever encountered. It was briefly respectable. It had a pamphlet and everything. The research was serious. Conducted in hospitals, psychiatric clinics, and university settings across North America and Europe, the early LSD studies followed the methodological standards of their time and produced results that were, depending on the condition being treated, sometimes extraordinary. A Canadian psychiatrist named Humphrey Osmond, who also, incidentally, coined the word psychedelic, was using LSD in the treatment of alcoholism in Saskatchewan and reporting recovery rates that dwarfed anything available through conventional therapy. His patients weren't just cutting back. They were stopping entirely, permanently, after 1 or 2 supervised sessions. The kind of results that, in any other context, would have triggered a cascade of follow-up studies and significant funding. In London and Los Angeles, LSD-assisted therapy was being used with patients suffering from severe anxiety, obsessive disorders, and the kind of treatment-resistant depression that conventional psychiatry had essentially given up on. Reports from these sessions described patients accessing emotional material that years of traditional talk therapy had never reached: buried grief, childhood trauma, the roots of phobias that had controlled their lives for decades. The therapist's role in these sessions was not to direct the experience, but to sit with the patient, hold the space, and work through whatever emerged afterward. Aldous Huxley, whose 1954 book The Doors of Perception described his own experience with mescaline in terms that would influence everyone who came after him, was convinced that psychedelics represented a genuine revolution in human self-understanding. He took LSD on his deathbed in November of 1963. The same afternoon President Kennedy was assassinated, which is one of those historical coincidences so strange it feels like the universe was trying to make a point. The medical establishment of the 1950s was not, by reputation, a wildly permissive institution. This was the era of the cardigan and the clipboard, of carefully documented case files and professional conservatism, and yet here were serious clinicians in serious journals reporting that a compound derived from a bread fungus was doing things that nothing in the pharmacological toolkit had ever managed. It was as if someone had discovered a new primary colour. The implications were genuinely difficult to process. What ended this period of productive, legitimate research was not a scientific finding. No study demonstrated that LSD was ineffective. No clinical trial suggested it was more dangerous than the researchers had understood. What ended it was culture, the slow then rapid spread of LSD out of clinical settings and into the hands of young people who had not been assigned a therapist and had not signed a consent form, and the panic that followed in the mainstream press and the halls of government. The pamphlet became a cautionary tale, the miracle drug became a menace, and the research stopped, mid-sentence, for 30 years. Here is where the story takes a turn that sounds like fiction, but is very much documented historical fact. The Central Intelligence Agency, having learned about LSD's extraordinary mind-altering properties, decided that the correct response was to secretly dose American citizens without their knowledge to see what would happen. The program was called MKUltra. It ran from the early 1950s into the 1960s, and its methods included giving LSD to prisoners, mental patients, soldiers, and ordinary civilians, sometimes in their drinks, sometimes under the guise of medical treatment, sometimes in CIA safe houses where agents watched from behind one-way mirrors taking notes. The goal, officially, was to develop a mind control weapon. What they got instead was chaos, lawsuits, at least one death, and, indirectly, one of the key figures in hippie history discovering LSD for the very first time. The program was authorized at the highest levels of the CIA and ran through at least 80 institutions, universities, hospitals, prisons, and private research facilities, many of which had no idea they were participating in a covert government program. Researchers were given grants with innocent-sounding names attached to front organizations. Patients who believed they were receiving standard psychiatric treatment were, instead, being given LSD, sometimes repeatedly, without their knowledge or consent. The ethical violations were, by any reasonable standard, staggering. The most notorious single incident involved a CIA biochemist named Frank Olson, who was secretly dosed with LSD at a work retreat in 1953 and 9 days later fell to his death from a New York hotel window. The CIA called it a suicide. His family called it murder. Decades of investigation and a partial government apology later, the question remains officially unresolved. It is the kind of story that makes you understand, in your bones, why a generation of young Americans developed a reflexive distrust of their government. But here is the dark irony that loops back into everything else. Among the CIA's experimental subjects at the Menlo Park Veterans Hospital was a young man named Ken Kesey, the same Ken Kesey who would go on to write One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest, buy a psychedelic bus, and become one of the central architects of the counterculture the government was simultaneously trying to understand and suppress. He signed up as a paid volunteer because he needed money and was curious. He walked out having discovered something that would reorganize his life and, through his life, the lives of hundreds of thousands of others. The government spent millions trying to turn LSD into a weapon of control. Instead, it handed it to the people who would use it to reject everything the government stood for. That is not a small irony. That is almost a complete summary of the 1960s in a single transaction. The CIA wanted to build a tool for breaking minds, and what it built accidentally was a door that a generation walked through and refused to come back through on the government's terms. MKUltra was eventually exposed through Freedom of Information Act requests in the 1970s, after the CIA director ordered most of the files destroyed, an order that was only partially successful, because a significant cache of documents had been misfiled in a financial records room and survived. What emerged was one of the more disturbing chapters in the history of American government, a program that had operated in secret for over a decade on the theory that the ends justified the means, and that the minds of American citizens were acceptable collateral damage in the Cold War. The hippies, had they known the full extent of it at the time, would have found it confirming everything they already believed. Ken Kesey first encountered LSD as a paid volunteer in a government-sponsored study at the Menlo Park Veterans Hospital in 1960, which is one of those historical ironies so perfect it almost feels invented. He went in as a curious young writer. He came out convinced that consciousness was a door that had been left unlocked for centuries, and that everyone deserved a key. Within a few years, Kesey had gathered a group of friends and fellow experimenters around him, called the Merry Pranksters. In 1964, they bought a school bus, painted it in colours that made your eyes feel confused, installed a sound system, loaded up on LSD, and drove across the country, handing out the experience to anyone who was interested and several people who were not entirely sure what they had agreed to. The bus was named Further. The destination was listed on the front as Interzone. The back said, Caution, Weird Load. The Pranksters were not technically an organisation. They had no membership form, no stated mission, and no coherent leadership structure beyond the general gravitational pull of Kesey's personality and the shared conviction that normal life was a kind of agreed-upon hallucination that everyone had the right to question. They filmed everything with early 16mm cameras, generating hundreds of hours of footage that would take decades to properly edit and release. The film was called the movie lowercase indefinite article because what it was exactly was difficult to define. A document of an experiment, a record of people in the process of becoming something they couldn't quite name. Their cross-country journey culminated in a series of events they called acid tests, gatherings with live music, strobing lights, projected film footage, and LSD freely available to everyone present, either in the punch or distributed by hand. The Grateful Dead, then known as the Warlocks, became the house band for these events. The experience was deliberately designed to be overwhelming, disorienting, and impossible to navigate using your usual mental categories. The whole point was to dissolve the frameworks and see what was underneath. You have to understand the cultural context to feel how strange this was. This was 1964 and 65. The Beatles had just arrived in America and were still making clean, cheerful pop music. The most transgressive thing most young Americans had encountered was a mildly suggestive magazine. And here was a group of people in a painted bus actively working to dismantle consensus reality at local gatherings in living rooms and rented halls across the country. Kesey was, by any measure, a genuinely talented writer. One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest had been published in 1962 to considerable acclaim, and its vision of institutional power crushing individual consciousness read differently after you understood where some of its imagery had come from. But he had largely stopped writing by the time the Pranksters hit the road, convinced that fiction was a limited vehicle for what he was trying to do. The experience itself was the art. The bus was the medium. The passengers were the message. What the Pranksters left behind was not a political program or a philosophical manifesto. It was a demonstration, rough, chaotic, joyful, and occasionally alarming, that another way of moving through the world was possible, that you could question every assumption simultaneously and not fall apart, that the journey, taken collectively and with eyes wide open, was more interesting than any destination anyone had mapped for you. The counterculture would spend the rest of the decade trying to figure out what to do with that idea. If Ken Kesey was the wildly enthusiastic distributor, Timothy Leary was the professor who gave the whole thing an air of academic credibility it would soon thoroughly destroy. Leary was a lecturer in clinical psychology at Harvard University when he first tried psilocybin mushrooms in Mexico in 1960, and came back to campus a genuinely changed man, changed in the way that means you can no longer make it through a faculty meeting without feeling like you are staring into the infinite. He launched the Harvard Psilocybin Project with his colleague Richard Alpert, conducting experiments on graduate students, prisoners, and theology students who took the substances in controlled settings and reported experiences of profound spiritual significance. Harvard was not, as it turned out, entirely comfortable with this direction for its psychology department. The Concord prison experiment was one of the most audacious studies Leary ran. Working with inmates at a Massachusetts correctional facility, his team administered psilocybin in therapy sessions, with the goal of reducing recidivism, the rate at which released prisoners reoffended and returned to jail. The initial results were remarkable. Participants reported profound shifts in self-understanding, in their relationship to violence, in their sense of connection to other human beings. Early follow-up data suggested the treated prisoners were reoffending at significantly lower rates than the general prison population. The Marsh Chapel experiment was stranger, and in some ways more consequential. Leary and Alpert worked with the theologian Walter Pankey to give psilocybin to divinity students during a Good Friday service at Boston University's Marsh Chapel. The control group received a placebo. 9 of the 10 students in the psilocybin group reported experiences they described as genuinely mystical, encounters with the divine that matched the classic literature of religious experience from across cultures and centuries. The one student who did not report a mystical experience required a sedative. 25 years later, follow-up interviews found that the participants still described the experience as among the most meaningful of their lives. Harvard, watching all of this with mounting institutional discomfort, eventually dismissed both Leary and Alpert in 1963, Alpert for giving psilocybin to an undergraduate, Leary for various failures to meet his academic obligations while spending increasing amounts of time at a communal mansion in Millbrook, New York, that had become the East Coast's answer to Kesey's La Honda compound. Leary's public persona evolved rapidly after Harvard. He became, increasingly, a provocateur and a performer, the man who told a generation to turn on, tune in, drop out, a phrase he claimed was inspired by a conversation with Marshall McLuhan, which is the kind of detail that makes you understand what a strange era the 60s were. He appeared on talk shows, debated politicians, wrote books, and made himself into the most visible face of psychedelic culture in America. He was also, many of his peers believed, partly responsible for the government crackdown that followed. By making LSD the symbol of open rebellion against every established institution, by daring the government publicly and repeatedly to come after him, he turned a nuanced and promising area of scientific inquiry into a culture war flashpoint. The researchers who had been quietly producing impressive clinical results watched as Leary handed their opponents every weapon they needed. He was, in the assessment of many who knew him, a genius at communication and a catastrophe at strategy, brilliant at starting fires, less gifted at controlling where they spread. By 1965, San Francisco's Haight-Ashbury neighborhood had become the unofficial headquarters of a movement that didn't have a name yet, a membership form, or a particularly coherent policy platform, but did have an extraordinary amount of LSD, and a shared sense that something enormous was happening. Victorian houses that had been quietly deteriorating for decades filled up with young people who had arrived from across the country with backpacks, guitars, and the general belief that they were participating in a historical event. Rents were cheap. The weather was tolerable. There were record stores and head shops and communal kitchens, and on any given afternoon someone was probably sitting on a stoop, explaining the nature of reality to a stranger who just arrived on a Greyhound bus from Ohio with $40 and absolutely no plan. The neighbourhood had been before its counterculture moment, a working-class district of divided Victorians and corner stores, home to black families pushed west by urban renewal in the Fillmore, and to artists and bohemians who had drifted over from North Beach when the Beat era wound down in the early 60s. The transition into Hippie Central happened gradually and then all at once, the way all neighbourhood transformations happen, the way all cultural moments happen slowly and quietly, until one day you looked around and everything had changed. The Haight had its own institutions. The Psychedelic shop, which opened in January of 1966, was the first head shop in America selling rolling papers, incense, underground newspapers, books on Eastern religion, and the general paraphernalia of a way of life that was still being invented in real time. The Oracle, the neighbourhood's underground newspaper, was printed in psychedelic rainbow roll inks that made it look like the LSD experience rendered in newsprint, which was very much the point. Community notice boards covered in hand-lettered announcements for events, workshops, free concerts, and philosophical discussion groups papered the storefronts. What the Haight offered, at its best, was a genuine experiment in alternative community, a neighbourhood-scale attempt to answer the question of whether people could organise their lives around values other than competition and consumption. The Digger Network was providing free food in the park. The Haight-Ashbury Free Clinic, opened in 1967, was offering medical care to anyone who walked in. There were free stores, free concerts, free schools, and a general ambient generosity that, to people arriving from mainstream American cities, felt genuinely transformative. It also had a dark underside that was visible to anyone paying close attention from the beginning. The runaways arriving daily were often teenagers in crisis. The free and open drug culture had no infrastructure for distinguishing between a carefully prepared psychedelic session and an impulsive bad decision. The predatory element that attaches itself to any community of young people far from home and operating outside conventional social structures was present and active. The diggers themselves, who were providing the practical services that kept the neighbourhood from complete collapse, were increasingly exhausted and increasingly alarmed by what they were seeing. When the neighbourhood's own community organisations held a mock death of hippie ceremony in October of 1967, a parade and symbolic funeral designed to announce that the media's concept of the hippie was dead, and that what remained was something more serious and politically engaged. It was partly an act of grief for what the summer of love had done to the place they had built. The neighbourhood had been loved to pieces, flooded with seekers, photographers, tourists and troubled young people, and what came out the other side was both more and less than what had gone in. The human be-in January of 1967 was the announcement. The summer of love was the actual event, and the actual event was significantly more chaotic than the posters suggested. Approximately 100,000 young people descended on San Francisco that summer in response to a cultural call to arms that had been broadcast through underground newspapers, word of mouth, and the general vibration of the era. The Haight-Ashbury neighbourhood, which had been managing its counterculture experiment with a certain scrappy charm, was suddenly overwhelmed. The sewers were stressed. The food supplies were inadequate. The free clinics that local activists had quietly established were treating everything from bad trips to malnutrition to hepatitis. and the city government was caught somewhere between horrified and completely unsure what to do with 100,000 young people who were, at least in theory, committed to non-violence and the healing of the world. The Human Be-In at Golden Gate Park on January 14th had drawn 20,000 people to hear Timothy Leary tell them to turn on and drop out, to watch Allen Ginsberg chant and a Hell's Angel guard the stage, to experience the peculiar electricity of a crowd that believed, collectively and with great sincerity, that it was inventing a new way of being human. The energy was contagious. The photographs went everywhere, and across the country, in small towns and suburbs and college dormitories, young people looked at those images and decided to go. What they arrived to find by June and July was a neighbourhood straining under the weight of its own mythology. The free food the diggers had been providing for hundreds was now needed for thousands. The crash pads, the communal houses where newcomers could sleep on floors, were overcrowded to the point of being health hazards. The Haight-Ashbury Free Clinic opened in June by Dr. David Smith, specifically because the regular medical system was not equipped to handle the volume and type of problems presenting, was seeing 100 patients a day within weeks. The music was extraordinary. The Grateful Dead played free in the park, Jefferson Airplane performed from the back of a flatbed truck, Janis Joplin, Big Brother and the Holding Company, The Doors, Country Joe and the Fish. The entire catalogue of the era was concentrated in a few square miles of San Francisco that summer, playing in clubs and parks and living rooms, and the music carried the feeling of the thing even when the logistics of the thing were falling apart. But the cameras were also there. Television crews from every network descended on the Haight to document the phenomenon, and what they filmed and broadcast was a simplified, photogenic version of something much more complicated. The flower crowns and the painted faces were real, but so was the teenager sleeping in a doorway with nowhere to go, the runaway, who had hitchhiked from Missouri and arrived to find that the free utopia was somewhat less organized than advertised. The media created a vision of the summer of love that was beautiful and that drew more people in, which made the actual situation more difficult and the gap between vision and reality larger. By the fall, many of the original Haight community had left, retreating to communes in rural California and New Mexico, exhausted and disillusioned. The neighborhood they left behind was different, harder, more commercial, less cohesive. The summer had been, in the memory of those who lived it, both the best thing that had ever happened and the beginning of the end. That particular combination is very human and very 1967. You cannot tell the story of LSD and the hippie movement without talking about what it did to music, because what it did to music was enormous and frankly a little alarming to anyone who'd been listening to clean 3-minute pop songs up until that point. Bands that had been playing cheerful radio-friendly melodies began making records that lasted 12 minutes, featured sitars, and included liner notes asking you to listen with headphones in a dark room for the full experience. The Beatles stopped touring and went into a studio and came out with Sgt. Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club Band. Jefferson Airplane released Surrealistic Pillow. The Grateful Dead began their long experiment with improvised live performance that would eventually produce concerts measuring in the hours. The music wasn't just influenced by psychedelics. In many cases, it was explicitly designed to replicate or deepen the experience of taking them, which made for extraordinary listening and occasionally very long concerts. The shift happened quickly. The Beatles' Rubber Soul, released in 1965, was still recognizably pop music, if more sophisticated and introspective than what had come before. Revolver, the following year, was something else. Tomorrow Never Knows, the final track, built on a drone, layered with tape loops running backwards and Lennon's vocals processed through a rotating speaker, is either a song or a guided experience, depending on how you approach it. By the time Sgt. Pepper arrived in June of 1967, the album as a format had been transformed. It was no longer a collection of songs, but a unified artistic statement, complete with a psychedelic cover designed to reward extended examination. The American bands were doing the same thing from a different direction. Jefferson Airplane's Grace Slick was singing about a white rabbit, chasing a logic built on Alice in Wonderland's drug metaphors, in a voice that sounded like it was coming from the bottom of a very deep well. The Doors' first album, released the same year, featured an 11-minute track about an Oedipal fantasy that absolutely no radio station should have played, and several did. These were not easy, comfortable records. They were designed to unsettle. The Grateful Dead took the logic furthest, converting the concert itself into the art form. Their live performances began incorporating extended improvisational passages, jams, in the vocabulary of the era, that could last 20 minutes or more, during which the band would drift into territories of rhythm and melody that had no precedent in popular music. The audience was not expected to listen passively. They were expected to participate in the experience, to move with it, to contribute their energy to whatever was being collectively generated in the room. The technology bent to serve the music. Guitarist Jimi Hendrix, who was not strictly a hippie, but was very much a product of the same psychedelic moment, was using feedback, wah-wah pedals, and left-handed restringing to produce sounds from a guitar that no one had believed a guitar could produce. His performance of the Star-Spangled Banner at Woodstock, in which the melody dissolves into what sounds like bombs falling and people screaming and then reassembles at the end, is either the most patriotic or the most anti-war piece of music produced in the 1960s, and the fact that it is genuinely impossible to decide which is part of what makes it extraordinary. What the music of this era did at its best was create a shared interior space, a place inside a song where you could go and find other people already there. That is what music always does, but the psychedelic era did it with a particular intensity, a particular willingness to push into uncomfortable emotional territory and sit there until something shifted. It asked more of its listeners than most popular music did, and its listeners, by and large, were grateful for the ask. Behind the scenes of the Summer of Love, keeping the whole chemical infrastructure of the movement quietly functional, was a man named Augustus Owsley Stanley III, known to everyone simply as Owsley. He was a self-taught chemist, the grandson of a Kentucky senator, and by 1965 he had established himself as the premier underground producer of LSD in the United States, which is a sentence that would have meant nothing 5 years earlier, and by 1967 meant everything. Owsley produced LSD in tabs of documented purity and consistent dosage, which sounds like a quality control detail but was actually significant in a world where the alternative was taking something of unknown strength from an unknown source and hoping for the best. He also served as the Grateful Dead sound engineer, which perhaps explains certain aspects of their live performance approach. Owsley had dropped out of the University of Virginia, served in the Air Force, briefly studied ballet, and was working as a radio engineer at a Berkeley radio station when he encountered LSD for the first time in 1964. His response was characteristic of a certain type of highly systematic intelligence encountering something that completely reorganizes its priorities. He immediately set out to understand it as thoroughly as possible, which in his case meant learning to make it himself. He taught himself organic chemistry from textbooks, rented a house in Berkeley, and established his first laboratory in the bathroom. His initial synthesis in 1965 yielded roughly 500 doses. By the end of that year, he had produced several 100,000. By the time he was arrested in 1967, a raid on his Point Richmond laboratory that was announced on the front page of the San Francisco Chronicle, estimates of his total production ran into the millions of doses. What distinguished Owsley's product, and what gave him a reputation that spread through the movement like a form of brand loyalty was consistency. In a market where you genuinely could not know what you were getting, the purple double dome or the white lightning or the window pane that came with Owsley's name attached was known to be reliably what it said it was at the strength it was advertised. He was in effect practicing a form of consumer protection in a completely unregulated market, which is not a sentence that appears often in the literature of drug enforcement, but accurately describes what he was doing. His relationship with the Grateful Dead was central to both parties. He funded the band in their early years in exchange for the ability to follow them and observe the effect of his product on large groups of people in a musical setting, an arrangement that gave the Dead resources they desperately needed and gave Owsley a laboratory the size of a concert venue. He also built them their famous wall of sound system in the 1970s, a speaker array so large and so technically sophisticated that it remains, by many accounts, the finest live sound reinforcement system ever constructed. After his arrest and subsequent imprisonment in the early 1970s, Owsley eventually settled in Australia, where he spent his later years as a sculptor working in bronze, a committed advocate for a high-fat, zero-carbohydrate diet, and an occasional interviewee for documentarians attempting to reconstruct the era he had helped to supply. He died in a car accident in Queensland in 2011 at 76 years old. His contribution to the chemistry of the counterculture was enormous. His public profile was surprisingly modest, and his quality control, by all accounts, was immaculate. The Grateful Dead occupied a position in the hippie ecosystem that was genuinely unusual. They were a band that frequently played for free, that encouraged fans to record their shows, that built a community rather than a fan base, and that seemed constitutionally incapable of playing a song the same way twice. They were also, to a significant degree, the house band of the movement, playing at prankster events, at the Haight, at Woodstock, and at an extraordinary number of benefits and free concerts that kept the counterculture's social architecture functioning. Jerry Garcia, their guitarist and reluctant figurehead, spoke about LSD's influence on the band's music in terms of expanding the space available inside a song, the sense that a three-chord progression could become a landscape you walked around inside of rather than a structure you passed through. The band formed in the Bay Area in 1965, drawing from the overlapping worlds of jug band music, blues, folk, and jazz, and from the beginning their approach to performance was shaped by the environment in which they developed. The acid test required music that could sustain extended, unpredictable experiences, that could hold a room full of people in various states of consciousness for hours without demanding their attention in the conventional way. The Dead learned to play long before long was fashionable, and they learned to improvise before the audience expected improvisation. Their first free concerts were practical decisions as much as philosophical ones. The Haight needed music. The movement needed gathering points. The Dead lived in the neighbourhood, stored their equipment nearby, and could be persuaded with relative ease to set up in the park on a Sunday afternoon and play until the light changed. They did this frequently, and the community they built through those performances was not an audience in the normal sense. It was a constituency, a congregation, a portable neighbourhood that reassembled around the band wherever they played. What made this economically viable, barely, was a combination of paid club and ballroom shows, the occasional major festival, and a band and management structure that prioritised survival over wealth for long enough that the community became self-sustaining. The Deadhead following that developed through the 1970s. Fans who followed the band from city to city on tour, sleeping in vans, trading tapes of shows, building a secondary economy of handmade goods around the concert parking lots, was the practical expression of the counterculture's communal ideal, stripped of its political ambitions and concentrated into something more durable. The taping culture was significant. The Dead actively encouraged fans to record their shows and circulate the tapes, which was economically irrational by every standard music industry logic, and culturally transformative in ways that the industry would not fully reckon with for decades. Every tape traded in a parking lot was a small act of information sharing, of communal ownership, of the conviction that music was not a product to be owned, but an experience to be passed along. Garcia himself was a reluctant symbol. He disliked being called a leader, resisted the guru role that the audience wanted to assign him, and spent much of his public career trying to redirect attention from his person to the music. He was also, by the end of his life, a man in serious physical decline, his health compromised by decades of heroin use and the physical demands of near-constant touring. He died in 1995 at 53 in a drug rehabilitation facility in Forest Knolls, California, and the grief that followed was not the grief of fans for a celebrity. It was the grief of a community for the person who had, for 30 years, shown up and held the space open. That is a rarer thing than fame, and it lasts differently. Someone had to be practical, and in the Haight-Ashbury of 1967, that job fell largely to a loose group of anarchist activists called the Diggers, who had decided that the correct response to a neighbourhood full of young people with no money and no plan was to simply feed them. Every day, the Diggers set up in the panhandle of Golden Gate Park and gave away free food, cooked in a communal kitchen, paid for by donations, and distributed with the explicit philosophical position that everything should be free and the profit motive was the fundamental disease of American society. They also ran a free store where everything was free, which is a concept that sounds obvious when stated plainly, but apparently required explaining to an uncomfortable number of people. The Diggers took their name from a 17th century English agrarian movement, whose members had occupied common land and declared that the earth belonged to everyone. The San Francisco version was led by figures like Emmett Grogan and Peter Coyote, who would later become an actor of some note, which is exactly the kind of career trajectory that only the 1960s could produce, and they operated on the principle that theatre and direct action were the same thing. Their distributions in the park were performances as much as they were meals. Food was served through a large wooden frame called the free frame of reference. The message was literal and conceptual simultaneously. Step through the frame and everything on the other side is free. The food itself was gathered from restaurant surplus, from donations, from whatever the Diggers could persuade, borrow or liberate from the commercial food system. They cooked in a communal kitchen on Frederick Street, producing stews and soups and whatever else could be made in quantity from ingredients that range from entirely reasonable to deeply optimistic. The quality varied. The commitment did not. Every afternoon, the frame went up in the panhandle and the food went out, and the implicit argument was made again. A society that could not feed its young people was not, in any meaningful sense, functioning. The Haight-Ashbury Free Clinic, which opened on June 6th of 1967, timed deliberately to coincide with the anticipated flood of Summer of Love arrivals, was the medical parallel to what the Diggers were doing with food. Dr. David Smith, a young physician who had been watching the neighbourhood fill up with young people who had no money and no access to the conventional medical system, opened the clinic with volunteer staff, donated equipment, and the straightforward conviction that people needed medical care regardless of their ability to pay. The clinic treated everything from bad trips to infected wounds to the early signs of the hepatitis and venereal disease outbreaks that were quietly spreading through the overcrowded neighbourhood. The bad trip cases were particularly instructive. The standard medical response to someone experiencing LSD-induced panic in 1967 was to sedate them heavily and place them in a psychiatric ward, which almost invariably made the experience worse and sometimes produced lasting trauma. The free clinic developed a different approach, quiet, supportive, talking the person through the experience rather than suppressing it. The same approach that the original clinical researchers had been using and that the emergency medicine establishment had not caught up with. They called it talking someone down, and it worked. What the diggers and the free clinic shared was a recognition that idealism requires infrastructure. You could not build a new society on philosophy alone. Somebody had to cook the stew, staff the clinic, haul the frame to the park, and show up again the next day when the crowd was larger and the resources were thinner. The people who did that work were not the ones who ended up on the album covers or in the documentaries. They were the ones who kept the lights on while everyone else was discussing what the lights meant. The hippie movement and the anti-war movement were never entirely the same thing, but they overlapped so thoroughly that by 1967 it was difficult to find one without the other nearby. The war in Vietnam was the grinding, televised reality that gave urgency to everything the counterculture was saying about the American system, about who it served, who it sacrificed, and what it asked its young men to do in its name. The draft was not abstract. It touched every family, every neighbourhood, every campus. Young men who had been sitting in Haight-Ashbury apartments discussing the nature of consciousness in the afternoon could receive their draft notices in the morning. The collision of psychedelic idealism and the very concrete reality of a war that was killing 50,000 Americans and millions of Vietnamese was the fault line the movement would eventually crack along. The draft lottery system introduced in 1969 made the arbitrariness of who went and who didn't visible in a way that was impossible to ignore. Your birthday determined your number. Your number determined your odds. A low number meant Vietnam with near certainty. A high number meant safety. There was no logic to it, no justice to it, no principle by which you could justify the outcome. It was chance wearing the uniform of policy, and it was being administered by a government that the counterculture had already concluded was not operating in good faith. Draft card burnings became a form of political theatre that managed to be simultaneously symbolic and genuinely consequential. Destroying your draft card was a federal offence carrying a 5-year prison sentence. The young men who did it were not making a casual gesture. They were making a choice that could cost them years of their lives, and many of them made it publicly, in front of news cameras, because the point was to be seen. The moral seriousness of that choice did not always sit comfortably alongside the more ecstatic aspects of the counterculture, and the tension between political urgency and psychedelic dissolution was one that the movement never fully resolved. The March on the Pentagon in October of 1967 brought together the political and the theatrical in a way that only the 60s could have produced. Abbie Hoffman, the yippie provocateur who occupied a peculiar space between genuine radical and performance artist, announced that protesters would levitate the Pentagon through the power of collective intention. The exorcism did not technically succeed. The building remained at its original elevation, but 50,000 people showed up, and the confrontation between protesters and soldiers on the steps produced some of the most photographed images of the era, including the iconic moment of a young man placing a flower in the barrel of a soldier's rifle. The soldiers in those photographs were frequently the same age as the protesters. Many of them had been drafted. The image of two young men facing each other across a line that neither had fully chosen, one holding a flower, one holding a gun, was not a simple image of good versus evil. It was a portrait of a country in the process of tearing itself apart along lines of class, luck, and circumstance that the rhetoric of both sides frequently obscured. By the time the war ended in 1975, the counterculture as a coherent social movement had largely dissolved. But the anti-war activism it had helped sustain had done something real. Public opinion had shifted. Congressional support for the war had eroded. The draft had been ended in 1973. None of this had happened easily or without cost, but the sustained pressure of a generation refusing to go quietly had been a genuine force in the political outcome, which is worth remembering in those moments when it is tempting to conclude that protest accomplishes nothing. Woodstock was supposed to be a music festival. It was advertised as 3 days of peace and music, expected to draw maybe 50,000 people to a dairy farm in Bethel, New York, in August of 1969, and instead drew somewhere between 400,000 and 500,000, which meant that before a single note was played, the infrastructure had already collapsed. The fences had come down, and the organisers had declared it a free concert out of sheer necessity. What followed was, depending on who you ask, either proof that the hippie vision of peaceful communal life could actually work, or an extremely expensive and logistically challenging accident that happened to turn out mostly fine. It rained. The mud was profound. The food situation was managed with emergency airlifts. The medical tent treated a remarkable number of bad trips, and the music, by most accounts, was extraordinary. The site was Max Yazga's 600-acre dairy farm in Sullivan County, secured at the last minute after a succession of other locations fell through due to community opposition and permit problems. Yazga himself was a middle-aged Republican dairy farmer who had agreed to lease his land because he thought the young people deserved a place to gather, a decision that cost him friendships in the local community and produced a short speech from the stage that became one of the more quoted moments of the weekend. He told the crowd that 500,000 young people could be together for 3 days without violence, and that, alone, was proof of something. He was right, more or less. The logistical situation was, from the organisers' perspective, a continuous catastrophe that somehow did not become a human catastrophe. The New York State Thruway was closed in both directions as traffic backed up for 20 miles. People abandoned their cars and walked the final miles through the countryside. The food vendors who had been contracted to supply the event were overwhelmed within hours, and the hog farm commune, led by Wavy Gravy, stepped in to run a free kitchen that fed thousands of people who had arrived without adequate supplies and no realistic plan for how to eat for 3 days in a field. The medical operation was improvised and impressive in roughly equal measure. The Woodstock Medical Committee treated hundreds of bad trips using the same approach the Haight-Ashbury Free Clinic had developed. Calm, supportive, talking people through the experience rather than sedating them. There were 3 deaths over the weekend, one from a heroin overdose, one from a burst appendix, one from a sleeping bag run over by a tractor. There were also 3 births, which the mythology tends to emphasize more heavily, because the ratio is better. Jimi Hendrix closed the festival on Monday morning, playing to a crowd that had thinned from its peak, but still numbered in the hundreds of thousands, many of them mud-caked, sleep-deprived, and profoundly altered in ways they would spend years trying to describe. His set included the Star-Spangled Banner performance that has been analysed, debated, and referenced ever since. A musical argument about America that was too complicated for a bumper sticker and too powerful to ignore. What Woodstock represented, in the cultural memory that formed around it, was the moment the counterculture proved it could happen at scale. 500,000 people, mostly young, mostly improvising, in conditions of genuine scarcity, and the dominant mode was cooperation rather than conflict. That is not nothing. It is in fact the thing that everyone who was there spent the rest of their lives trying to explain to everyone who wasn't. 4 months after Woodstock, the Rolling Stones played a free concert at the Altamont Speedway in California that was organised in roughly 72 hours, staffed in part by the Hells Angels Motorcycle Club, who had been hired as security in exchange for beer, and ended with multiple people injured, and one young man named Meredith Hunter stabbed to death near the stage. Altamont is the moment that cultural historians reach for when they want to mark the end of the 60s as a coherent idea, not because the violence was unprecedented in American life, but because it happened at an event that was supposed to be a celebration of everything the counterculture claimed to stand for. And the failure was both visible and documented on film. The Maysles brothers were there making a documentary. The cameras were rolling. The organisation, or rather the catastrophic lack of it, was the first problem. The Rolling Stones had been criticised during their American tour for charging high ticket prices, while the counterculture's idealism demanded free access to music, and the Altamont concert was conceived partly as a response to that criticism. A free show, a gesture of solidarity, a West Coast Woodstock staged on 4 days' notice. The venue was selected and then changed at the last minute. The Hells Angels were engaged through a chain of miscommunication that everyone later claimed not to have initiated. The stage was too low, placed at the base of a natural bowl rather than elevated above the crowd, which meant that the Angels, whose idea of crowd management involved pool cues, were essentially penned between 250,000 people and the band. The violence started before the Rolling Stones took the stage. Jefferson Airplane's set was interrupted when Marty Balin, the band's vocalist, jumped off the stage to help a concertgoer being beaten by Angels and was knocked unconscious. The Grateful Dead, scheduled to play before the Stones, assessed the situation and left without performing. Several members later said the energy felt wrong in a way that was impossible to specify but impossible to ignore. They were not wrong. Meredith Hunter was 18 years old. He was black, in a crowd that was overwhelmingly white, surrounded by angels who had been drinking since morning. Film footage later reviewed for the Maysles documentary shows him being shoved multiple times before the fatal confrontation. The angel who stabbed him was tried and acquitted on grounds of self-defense, having argued that Hunter drew a gun. The footage is ambiguous enough that the verdict was at least legally defensible, which is perhaps the most disturbing thing about it. What the counterculture's idealists had failed to account for at Altamont was something the diggers had understood all along. Community requires structure. The conviction that enough love and good intentions could substitute for logistics, crowd management and basic security was tested at Altamont and found catastrophically insufficient. The Angels were not hippies who had gone wrong. They were a biker gang hired with beer to perform a function they had no interest in and no training for, and the outcome was exactly as predictable as it sounds when stated plainly. The film that the Maysles brothers made, Gimme Shelter, released the following year, did not editorialize. It simply showed what happened in sequence, with Mick Jagger watching the footage in an editing suite afterward, his face doing the work of a paragraph. The 60s had ended in August, at Woodstock, with Flowers and Mud and Hendrix playing the national anthem. They ended again in December, at Altamont, with something darker and less redeemable, and the echo of the second ending was louder. The federal government had been watching the spread of LSD through American youth culture with increasing alarm since the mid-60s, and in 1968 it became illegal. 2 years later, the Controlled Substances Act of 1970 placed LSD in Schedule 1 alongside heroin, a category reserved for substances with no accepted medical use and high abuse potential, a classification that ended clinical research programs that had been producing genuinely promising results for almost 2 decades. Richard Nixon famously called Timothy Leary the most dangerous man in America, which is an extraordinary thing to say about a former psychology lecturer who primarily advocated for introspection, but reflected how thoroughly the government had come to see the counterculture as an existential threat rather than a passing fashion. The war on drugs, as a policy framework, was not announced as a war on the counterculture. It was announced as a public health initiative, a response to the dangers of substance abuse, a protection of American families from the corrupting influence of illegal drugs. But Nixon's domestic policy advisor, John Ehrlichman, speaking to a journalist decades later in one of the more candid admissions in American political history, described the original intent with considerably less euphemism. He said the Nixon administration had two enemies, the anti-war left and black people, and that by associating the left with marijuana and black people with heroin, criminalizing both heavily, and disrupting those communities, they could damage their enemies. You couldn't make it illegal to be anti-war or black, he said, but you could criminalize their associated behaviors and then arrest their people. The impact of scheduling on the scientific research was immediate and comprehensive. Researchers who'd been working with LSD in clinical settings found their supplies cut off, their grants revoked, and their institutional support evaporated. The compound was still fascinating, the results that had been documented were still real, but the legal framework had reclassified a research tool as a controlled substance with no medical use, which made conducting research on it essentially impossible, because the Schedule I classification required a circular proof. You could not demonstrate medical use without research, and you could not conduct research without demonstrating established medical use. The criminal penalties that followed were severe and applied unevenly. Marijuana convictions, which disproportionately targeted Black and Latino communities despite roughly equal rates of use across racial groups, resulted in prison terms that destroyed careers, families, and communities. The young white hippies in the Haight who smoked marijuana openly on the street were occasionally arrested and more often photographed. The people serving serious prison time for equivalent behavior tended to look different and come from different neighborhoods. Nixon's declaration of a war on drugs in 1971 escalated this dynamic. The language of war, applied to a domestic population, authorized the kind of enforcement that would have been unthinkable in any other context. Stop-and-frisk policies, no-knock warrants, mandatory minimum sentences, tools that were applied to drug enforcement became instruments of social control that outlasted the counterculture by decades. What is historically remarkable is how effectively the policy achieved its cultural goals while failing almost completely at its stated public health goals. Drug use did not decline in proportion to the enforcement. The research that might have led to effective treatments was suppressed, and the social movements that the criminalization was partly designed to disrupt were damaged, not destroyed, but damaged, pushed onto the defensive, deprived of the cultural oxygen they had been breathing. The flowers lasted a summer. The war on them lasted much longer. Timothy Leary's personal story in the late 1960s and early 70s reads less like a biography and more like a novel that someone submitted without finishing, because the events are so improbable that it is difficult to present them as a coherent arc. He was arrested multiple times, convicted of marijuana possession in a case that went to the Supreme Court, sentenced to 30 years in prison, escaped from a minimum security facility with help from the Weather Underground, fled to Algeria, where he briefly lived under the protection of the Black Panther Party in exile, then moved to Switzerland, then Afghanistan, where he was captured by American agents and extradited back to the United States in 1973. He eventually cooperated with the FBI. His friends did not entirely forgive him for this. The original arrest in 1965 came at the Texas-Mexico border, where Leary's daughter was found in possession of marijuana. Leary took responsibility to protect her and was convicted under the Marijuana Tax Act in a case that became a legal landmark. He argued that forcing him to pay a federal marijuana tax constituted self-incrimination, a Fifth Amendment violation, and the Supreme Court agreed in 1969, overturning his conviction. It was a genuine legal victory, arrived at after years of proceedings, and it was the last piece of straightforwardly good news in Leary's legal saga. In 1970, on a separate marijuana possession charge in California, he was sentenced to 10 years. Nixon's administration, furious at the counterculture's use of Leary as a symbolic figurehead, had been escalating the charges against him for years. When he was classified by prison psychologists as a minimum security risk, he had helped design the psychological test being used, having developed it earlier in his academic career, and had answered accordingly. He was placed in a facility in San Luis Obispo. On September 12th of 1970, he climbed a telephone pole, crossed to a nearby building's roof, and disappeared into a waiting car. The escape had been arranged by the Weather Underground, the radical left organisation that had moved from protest to bombings after concluding that peaceful resistance had failed. They charged $15,000 for the service, which Leary's supporters paid. In Algiers, he joined Eldridge Cleaver and the Black Panther Party in exile, an arrangement that deteriorated rapidly. Cleaver, a serious revolutionary operating under the considerable stress of permanent exile, had limited patience for what he viewed as Leary's psychedelic philosophizing, and placed him under a form of house arrest that Leary eventually fled. He moved to Switzerland, where a wealthy arms dealer named Michel Hauchard provided shelter in exchange for the film rights to his life story. He moved to Afghanistan. He was arrested there by American agents in Kabul in 1973 and extradited. Back in California, in prison, he cooperated with the FBI, providing information about the Weather Underground and other radical organizations with whom he'd been in contact during his years underground. The extent and significance of what he disclosed has been disputed ever since, but the act itself damaged his reputation within the left irreparably. Allen Ginsberg stopped speaking to him for a period. Other friends and allies made their feelings known with varying degrees of directness. He was released in 1976, The Counterculture Memory, and his role in it a subject of complicated retrospective assessment. He spent his later years as a public intellectual of the digital age, enthusiastic about personal computers and the internet in terms that echoed his earlier enthusiasm for psychedelics, tools for expanding consciousness, dismantling centralized authority, liberating the individual mind. He died in Beverly Hills in 1996 of prostate cancer, reportedly in good humor, having arranged for his final moments to be videotaped. Some of his ashes were later launched into space. The commune was the practical architecture of hippie idealism, the idea that if you could simply remove yourself from the capitalist system, live collectively on the land, share resources and labour and child-rearing and decision-making, you could demonstrate by example that another way of living was possible. By the late 1960s, there were hundreds of communes scattered across rural America, from Vermont to New Mexico to the mountains of Northern California, and the gap between the theory and the daily reality was frequently instructive. The theory involved communal harmony, sustainable agriculture, spiritual growth, and the liberation of the individual from artificial social constraints. The daily reality involved a lot of disagreements about whose turn it was to clean the composting toilet, people who had interpreted shared resources to mean they personally did not need to, work, and the discovery that growing enough food to feed 20 people requires significantly more agricultural knowledge than most urban 22-year-olds possess. The most famous communes of the era became, in their own ways, legends. The Farm, founded by Stephen Gaskin, and a convoy of school buses that left San Francisco in 1970 and landed in Tennessee, grew into one of the most successful intentional communities in American history. A 1,000-acre property that developed its own midwifery practice, publishing house, and soy foods company, and that still exists today in modified form. Drop City in Colorado, founded in 1965, built geodesic dome structures from salvaged car rooftops and attempted total communal living before deteriorating into the kind of interpersonal conflict that tends to develop when 20 people live in domes with insufficient privacy and insufficient income. The agricultural failures were common and, in retrospect, predictable. Most commune founders were young people from urban and suburban backgrounds, whose relationship to food production was limited to knowing roughly which aisle of the supermarket contained it. They arrived on rural land with seeds, good intentions, and very little else. The learning curve was steep and the consequences of failure were immediate. You did not eat what you did not grow, and you did not grow what you did not understand. Many communes survived their first years partly through the intervention of neighbouring farmers who, with varying degrees of exasperation and generosity, taught the new arrivals the basics that the books had not covered. The governance problems were equally instructive. The counterculture's deep suspicion of hierarchy meant that most communes began with flat, non-hierarchical decision-making structures, consensus-based processes in which everyone had equal voice on every question. In theory, this was the democratic ideal. In practice, it meant that decisions about whether to build a second outhouse could consume an entire afternoon, that the people most willing to dominate group conversations became de facto leaders regardless of the official structure, and that the communes that survived longest were often the ones that eventually quietly adopted some form of practical leadership structure while continuing to describe themselves as non-hierarchical. The children raised on communes occupy a complicated position in this history. They had, by most accounts, childhoods of remarkable freedom and remarkable instability, deep connection to land and animals and community, alongside the insecurities of communal poverty, parental preoccupation with collective politics, and the general atmosphere of adults working through personal transformations while responsible for small people who needed meals and bedtimes. Their retrospective accounts of commune childhoods range from deeply grateful to quietly furious, often within the same person, often within the same paragraph. What the commune experiment proved, at scale and with considerable human cost, was that building an alternative society is harder than criticizing the existing one. That is not a trivial lesson. It is in fact one of the most important lessons of the 1960s, and it is one that subsequent generations of idealists have had to learn again, in different contexts, at regular intervals ever since. Charles Manson is the figure who sits at the most disturbing edge of this history, a man who understood the counterculture's communal vocabulary, its distrust of mainstream society, its openness to charismatic leadership, and its use of LSD as a tool for dismantling ego and creating group cohesion, and used all of it to build a cult that he directed toward murder. The Tate LaBianca killings in August of 1969 did not cause the end of the hippie movement in any direct sense, but they arrived at a moment when the movement was already fracturing, and they gave the mainstream press and a nervous public a story about what happened when you removed the guardrails of conventional society and replaced them with flower crowns and the word of a self-appointed messiah. Manson had spent most of his adult life in prison and juvenile detention before his release in 1967. He arrived in San Francisco during the Summer of Love, a 32-year-old ex-convict in a neighborhood full of teenagers who had run away from home, who were hungry for meaning, who were operating outside conventional social structures, and who had been told repeatedly that love and openness were the correct response to every human being they encountered. He was, from the beginning, predatory in a way that the counterculture's ideology had no ready defense against, because the ideology specifically discouraged the kind of skeptical self-protection that might have served as one. He gathered a group of young followers, primarily women, who became known as the family. He used LSD in group sessions to accelerate the psychological processes of attachment and ego dissolution, techniques borrowed directly from the counterculture's therapeutic vocabulary and stripped of any protective context. He controlled access to food, sleep, and social contact. He presented himself as a Christ figure, a prophet, a man with a special understanding of the coming racial apocalypse he called helter-skelter, a term drawn from a Beatles song that he believed contained coded messages directed at him personally. The murders in August of 1969 of Sharon Tate and 4 others at a house in Bel Air, of Leno and Rosemary LaBianca the following night, were designed by Manson to trigger the race war he had prophesied. The logic was delusional. The execution was real. 7 people died. The family members who carried out the killings were young women who had been systematically broken down and rebuilt around Manson's worldview over a period of months. They were, in the truest sense of the term, victims who became perpetrators, which does not reduce their responsibility, but does complicate the simple narrative of evil that the press preferred. What the Manson case did to the counterculture's public image was significant and lasting. Every element of the hippie aesthetic, the communal living, the LSD use, the rejection of mainstream values, the charismatic male leader with devoted young followers, was present in the family, recast in the light of murder. The mainstream press, which had been covering the counterculture with a mixture of bewilderment and condescension, now had a story that confirmed its darkest fears. The summer of love had produced Charles Manson. The flowers had been covering something rotten. The people who had actually built the counterculture, the diggers feeding people in the park, the clinic doctors treating bad trips, the musicians playing free concerts, had nothing to do with Manson and everything he represented. But cultural narratives do not make those distinctions carefully, and the image of the family burned into the public consciousness by months of sensational press coverage and a televised trial attached itself to the hippie identity with a persistence that the movement's genuine accomplishments struggled to overcome. The counterculture promised liberation, and for many women who joined it, the promise felt, at least initially, real. The freedom from suburban domesticity, from the enforced cheerfulness of the 50s housewife ideal, from the constricting femininity that their mothers had navigated. But as the movement matured and its internal power dynamics became clearer, a persistent pattern emerged. The men led, philosophized, and received the credit, while the women cooked, cared for children, and were expected to express their liberation primarily through sexual availability. By the late 60s, women within the counterculture were beginning to articulate this contradiction explicitly, and the frustrations they brought back from communes and collectives and free love arrangements fed directly into the second-wave feminist movement, which drew its membership partly from women who had participated in hippie culture and found that the revolution, when it came to gender, stopped considerably short of their front door. The free love ideology of the counterculture was, in its formal articulation, about liberation from the possessiveness and jealousy that conventional monogamy could produce, about recognizing that love was not diminished by being shared, and that sexual connection between consenting adults was not a moral problem. The ideology was stated in gender-neutral terms. The application was not. In practice, free love in most counterculture communities meant that men had sex with multiple women, and women were expected to be cheerfully accepting of this arrangement, because jealousy was a bourgeois emotion and possessiveness was a form of property relations that the revolution was supposed to have abolished. Women who objected were told they were not sufficiently evolved. Women who asserted preferences were characterized as uptight, as carrying the conditioning of the straight world into spaces that had moved beyond it. The vocabulary of liberation was weaponized against the people it was supposed to serve, which is a pattern that appears in social movements with uncomfortable regularity and was documented by women in the counterculture with increasing clarity and anger as the 60s progressed. Robin Morgan, writing in 1970, described the situation with the kind of precise fury that the moment demanded. She'd been involved in the counterculture and the New Left, and she named what she had observed. Women making coffee and doing mimeograph work and providing sexual availability, while men made speeches and wrote manifestos and took the microphone. She was not alone in this observation. hundreds of women across the movement were reaching the same conclusions through the same experiences, and the feminist organisations and publications that emerged from those conclusions, Ms. Magazine, the National Organisation for Women, the consciousness-raising groups that met in living rooms across the country, drew directly on the energy of women who'd been through the counterculture and emerged from it with specific, well-founded grievances. The women who were celebrated within the counterculture, Janis Joplin, Grace Slick, the female singers and artists who defined the era's aesthetic, navigated this terrain in their own ways. Joplin, whose voice was the most powerful instrument in the San Francisco scene, drank heavily, loved recklessly, and died at 27 in a Hollywood motel room of a heroin overdose alone. She had been one of the most celebrated performers of her generation, and one of the loneliest people in the room she walked into. The counterculture loved her voice. It was less, attentive to what her life cost her. The women who left the counterculture and built the feminist movement took something valuable with them. The experience of having organised, spoken and acted collectively, the skills and the confidence that activism develops, and the absolutely clarifying anger of people who've been promised liberation and receive something considerably less. They did not waste it. The hippie movement was overwhelmingly white, and this was not an accident. The free-spirited rejection of mainstream America that the counterculture celebrated was a position of considerable privilege. It was much easier to voluntarily opt out of a system if that system had, in fact, been offering you something. For black Americans navigating segregation, redlining, police brutality, and the Vietnam draft that fell disproportionately on poor and minority men, the invitation to drop out, tune in, and grow flowers in your hair was not quite the obvious choice it seemed to young white people from the suburbs. Black musicians were central to the cultural fabric the movement wore. The blues, soul, and R&B that fed into rock and roll were the bones of the music, but the social benefits of the counterculture's moment mostly flowed elsewhere. The dynamic was visible in the music itself. Rock and roll was black music. It had grown from the blues and rhythm and blues traditions of black American artists, and the white musicians who built the British invasion and the San Francisco sound were, to varying degrees and with varying levels of acknowledgement, building on a foundation they had not laid. Elvis Presley's most essential debt was to artists like Big Mama Thornton and Arthur Crudup. The Rolling Stones' earliest recordings were covers of Chicago blues songs. The music that became the anthem of the white counterculture was derived in substantial part from a cultural tradition produced by people who were simultaneously being denied the basic rights the counterculture was claiming to champion. The Black Power movement and the counterculture occupied adjacent space in the landscape of 1960s radicalism, but operated from fundamentally different premises. Where the hippie movement emphasized individual consciousness expansion and a kind of universalist love. Everyone philosophy, Black Power emphasized collective political action, economic self-determination, and the specific particular demands of people who had been systematically excluded from American life. The Haight-Ashbury ideal of dropping out of the system was not available to people who had never been fully included in it. You cannot opt out of something that has never offered you the option of opting in. Jimi Hendrix occupied the fault line between these worlds with a complexity that his white audiences were frequently unable or unwilling to see. He was celebrated by the counterculture as its most visionary musician, invited to close Woodstock, photographed in the iconography of the era. He was also a black man in a world where black men were being beaten on bridges in Selma and shot in Memphis, and he navigated the expectations of a predominantly white audience and a predominantly white industry with a public composure that concealed the tension his private accounts documented. He died in London in September of 1970 at 27. The Black Panther Party, founded in Oakland in 1966, engaged with the counterculture's anti-war politics while remaining clear-eyed about the differences in their situations. when the Panthers ran their free breakfast program for children, feeding thousands of kids in cities across the country before school, addressing a real and immediate need with practical, direct action, it was recognized by those paying attention as a more effective form of community organizing than anything the Haight had produced. The FBI recognized it too, which is why it was targeted for disruption under the COINTELPRO program. What the counterculture's whiteness meant, ultimately, was that its analysis of American society was incomplete. A movement that diagnosed the problem as consciousness, materialism and conformity, without fully reckoning with race and structural power, was doing important work on some dimensions and deliberately or unconsciously avoiding others. The movements that lasted, that changed law and policy and the material conditions of people's lives, tended to be the ones that kept both dimensions in view simultaneously. The ones that didn't were, in the end, easier to absorb. While the philosophical and political content of the counterculture was being argued about in communal kitchens and underground newspapers, the visual language of the movement was being quietly invented in print shops, poster studios, and storefronts along Haight Street that sold everything from rolling papers to handmade jewellery to books on Eastern religion in quantities the publishers had not anticipated. The psychedelic poster art of the era, produced for Fillmore concert series by artists like Wes Wilson and Victor Moscoso, was a direct visual translation of the LSD experience onto paper, with letters that dissolved into their backgrounds, colours that vibrated against each other, and compositions that rewarded extended contemplation. It was the aesthetic of a generation that had decided normal visibility was insufficient, and that every surface was an opportunity. The Fillmore Auditorium and the Avalon Ballroom were the two primary venues where the San Francisco Sound developed its live identity, and both produced weekly concert posters that became an art form in their own right. Bill Graham, who managed the Fillmore, commissioned posters from a rotating group of artists who were given near-total creative freedom in exchange for legibility, a condition some of them interpreted loosely. The letters on these posters bent and melted and stacked on top of each other in ways that required active effort to decode, which was either a design flaw or a deliberate invitation to slow down and look more carefully, depending on your perspective. They were printed in limited quantities, distributed as advertising, and are now worth hundreds of dollars apiece. Nobody involved predicted that. Wes Wilson developed the style most associated with the era, sinuous, Art Nouveau-influenced letter forms in which every curve suggested biological process, every composition seemed to be in motion. Victor Moscoso, who had studied fine art formally, used colour theory in ways that made his posters actively uncomfortable to look at. Complementary colours at full saturation placed directly against each other, creating a visual vibration that matched what people were experiencing in the venues. The posters were not designed to be calming. They were designed to announce that something unusual was about to happen, and that you should probably prepare yourself accordingly. The head shops were the physical retail infrastructure of the movement, storefronts selling the objects and substances associated with counterculture life, in spaces that were themselves designed as aesthetic experiences. Blacklight fixtures made fluorescent posters glow. Incense layered the air with sandalwood and patchouli. Racks of underground newspapers and alternative publications lined the walls, alongside bead curtains and hand-thrown pottery and imports from India and Nepal that arrived in the wake of the counterculture's deep engagement with Eastern spiritual traditions. You could buy a hookah and a copy of the Tibetan Book of the Dead in the same transaction, which would have seemed an unlikely retail combination 5 years earlier. The visual culture extended into clothing, into the decorated vans and buses that moved commune members across the country, into the murals that appeared on the walls of Haight-Ashbury buildings and remained long after the neighbourhood had moved on. Peter Max became the movement's most commercially successful visual artist. His work was everywhere by 1968, on posters and album covers, and eventually on everything from tote bags to postage stamps, which was either a triumph or a co-optation depending on how you measured these things. What the visual culture of the era accomplished at its best was the creation of a shared aesthetic language that could communicate identity and affiliation at a glance. You knew from the poster on the wall or the pattern on the shirt or the bumper sticker on the van where someone stood, which was partly about community and partly about the very human need to be recognised, to have your inner landscape reflected back in the visible world. The counterculture built that reflection out of ink and colour and black light, and for a few years it was genuinely beautiful. Before the internet, before social media, before any of the communication infrastructure we now take for granted, the counterculture built its own media ecosystem from scratch, and it was remarkably effective. Underground newspapers, the San Francisco Oracle, the Berkeley Barb, the East Village Other, the Los Angeles Free Press, circulated in the tens of thousands, financed by advertising from head shops and concert promoters, written by participants in the movement for other participants, covering politics, music, philosophy, drug experiences, and community news, with an editorial voice that the mainstream press would not develop for another 2 decades. They were printed on cheap paper, stapled together, sold on street corners, and passed from hand to hand until they disintegrated, and they functioned as the nervous system of a movement that had no central organisation and no official leadership. The San Francisco Oracle was the most visually ambitious of these publications, printed in psychedelic rainbow roll inks that bled colours across the page in ways that made every issue look like it had been designed during a particularly productive acid trip, which several of them had. It covered mysticism, politics, music, and community organising with equal seriousness, treating all of these as aspects of the same project. Its circulation reached around 100,000 at its peak, distributed through a network of head shops and sympathetic bookstores that stretched across the country. The Berkeley Barb was angrier and more explicitly political, reflecting the sensibility of the campus radical culture that existed alongside the hippie scene but never entirely merged with it. It published investigative reporting on the Vietnam War, on police misconduct, on the government's surveillance of radical organisations, the kind of journalism that the mainstream press was performing cautiously, if at all, because its editors and publishers had relationships with the institutions being criticised that underground editors did not. The Barb also published personals and sexual content that would have been unpublishable elsewhere, which contributed to its circulation figures and complicated its political legacy in roughly equal measure. The Underground Press Syndicate, founded in 1966, created a wire service model for the alternative press. Member publications could reprint each other's content freely, which meant that a story broken by the Berkeley Barb could appear in papers from Boston to Austin within weeks. It was a distributed information network operating on principles of open sharing that would not become technologically mainstream for another 30 years. The people who built it had no idea they were prototyping something. The writing in these publications was uneven in quality, frequently brilliant, occasionally incomprehensible, and almost never boring. The journalists and essayists who came out of the underground press, Hunter S. Thompson developed his gonzo style, partly in relationship to this tradition. Though he worked primarily for the mainstream rolling, Stone brought a subjective, participatory approach to journalism that challenged the pretense of objectivity that the mainstream press maintained. The reporter was in the story. The reporter's experience was part of the evidence. This seemed radical at the time and is now the dominant mode of internet writing, which is either a vindication or a cautionary tale. The underground papers also functioned as community boards, event calendars, and lost and found services for a population that was frequently mobile and disconnected from conventional communication channels. If you arrived in a new city with no contacts and needed to find the commune or the free clinic or the next free concert, the local underground paper was where you looked. It was the Craigslist of the counterculture, printed on newsprint and smelling of cheap ink, and it worked. The early LSD experience, as described by many who took it in the middle 1960s, tended toward openness, connection, and dissolution of the boundaries between self and world that many found profoundly political in its implications. If you could genuinely feel your connection to other human beings, how could you support a war? How could you participate in a system built on competition and hierarchy? These were the conclusions that Timothy Leary was drawing, and Ken Kesey was drawing, and a generation of young Americans was drawing in various ways. But LSD does not always produce openness. It also produces paranoia, and as the 60s progressed, and as the government surveillance of the movement became known, and as provocateurs and informants appeared within activist organizations, the paranoid potential of psychedelics began to express itself more and more. The set-and-setting principle, articulated by Timothy Leary in his early research and understood by every serious researcher who worked with psychedelics, held that the experience produced by LSD was shaped as much by the environment and the psychological state of the user as by the compound itself. A person who felt safe, supported and prepared was likely to have a very different experience than a person who felt threatened, watched or uncertain. The early clinical research had been conducted in carefully controlled therapeutic settings precisely because the researchers understood this. The counterculture, distributing LSD at rock concerts and in crowded urban neighborhoods to people of varying psychological histories and no preparation, was operating without those controls. By 1968, the movement was under genuine government surveillance. The FBI's COINTELPRO program was actively infiltrating counterculture and radical organizations, inserting informants, spreading disinformation, and attempting to generate internal conflicts. The knowledge that this was happening, which spread through the movement partly through the underground press, was accurate, but it also interacted badly with the paranoia amplifying potential of psychedelics and the general atmosphere of a community under pressure. People began to see informants everywhere. Trusted friends became suspects. Organizations fractured along lines of accusation and counter-accusation, sometimes because genuine infiltrators had been identified, and sometimes because the paranoia had simply outrun the evidence. The Weather Underground, which emerged from the Students for a Democratic Society after that organization collapsed in 1969, represented one extreme of where the political energy of the era went when idealism curdled into desperation. They were not hippies. They explicitly rejected the counterculture's emphasis on personal transformation and insisted on direct confrontation with the state. But they drew from the same population of young people who had been radicalized by the war and the cities burning and the assassinations of King and Kennedy and the sense that peaceful means had been exhausted. Their bombings of symbolic targets, the Capitol building, the Pentagon, corporate headquarters, killed no one by design, but they provided the government with the justification it needed for the most aggressive elements of its response. LSD itself underwent a cultural meaning shift during this period. The substance that had represented opening and connection in 1967 was being discussed in very different terms by 1970, in terms of bad trips, of psychological damage, of the young people who had taken too much and not come all the way back. Some of these accounts were accurate, some were exaggerated by a press eager for cautionary material. But the cumulative effect was to change the cultural valence of psychedelics from promise to warning, from liberation to risk, which served the government's scheduling agenda and represented a genuine loss for the researchers who'd been doing careful work. The politics of the era ultimately overwhelmed the psychedelics rather than the other way around. LSD did not end the Vietnam War. It did not dismantle capitalism. it did not produce the transformation of human consciousness that its most enthusiastic advocates had predicted. What it produced, in the hands of the people who used it most thoughtfully, was a shift in individual perspective that was sometimes profound and sometimes permanent. That is not nothing. It is also not a revolution. Most of the institutions of the counterculture had dissolved or transformed beyond recognition by the mid-70s, but the Grateful Dead continued, and in continuing became something unusual, a living museum of the original spirit of the thing, carried forward by a travelling community of fans called Deadheads, who followed the band from city to city for years or decades, creating a portable counterculture that persisted long after the Haight had turned into a tourist attraction and Woodstock had become a brand. The Dead played until Jerry Garcia's death in 1995, by which point some Deadheads had been following the band for 30 years, and the campground economies that formed around their concerts, with vendors and traders and itinerant communities of hundreds, were a small, self-contained demonstration that some version of the original vision had never entirely let go. The band's longevity was in some ways improbable. They were not, by conventional music industry standards, efficiently managed. Their touring operation was enormous and expensive. Their studio albums were inconsistent. They had no radio hits in the conventional sense, and almost no mainstream chart presence. What they had instead was a relationship with their audience that was structured differently from any other band of their era, based on the live experience, on the variability of each performance, on the social world that formed around the concerts and extended between them through tape trading and newsletters and the informal networks of deadheads who found each other across the country. The taping culture that the Dead endorsed and eventually formally accommodated, with designated taper sections at the back of venues where fans set up microphones on tall stands and recorded every show, created an archive of the band's live work that is staggering in its completeness. There are recordings of essentially every Grateful Dead concert from the late 60s onward, circulated first on cassette tapes traded through the mail, and later digitized and made available online. It is one of the most thoroughly documented bodies of live performance in the history of popular music, and it exists because the band trusted their audience with it. Garcia himself aged into his role as the reluctant centre of this community with a combination of genuine warmth and genuine exhaustion. He gave interviews in which he expressed bewilderment at what the Dead had become, this enormous travelling circus, this community of tens of thousands, this institution that people organised their lives around. He had wanted to play music. He had played music for 30 years, and the music had become the container for something much larger than music. He was not always sure that was a good thing, and he said so. His health declined visibly through the 1980s and into the 90s. The heroin use that had been part of his private life for years became increasingly difficult to conceal. He was large, diabetic, a smoker, a man who'd been touring almost continuously for 3 decades, and who looked, by the early 90s, like someone carrying more weight than any body should reasonably be asked to bear. The Deadhead community watched this with a complicated love of people who understood that their beloved was not well and could not decide how much of their devotion was helping and how much was harm. When he died in August of 1995, the grief was immediate and enormous. Candlelight vigils in cities across the country, thousands of people gathering in public spaces to mourn a musician who had never wanted to be a symbol and had become the most durable one the counterculture produced. What the remaining members carried forward, eventually reconstituting as Dead and Company and other configurations, was the music and the community, but not the centre. Some things cannot be replaced. The music at least goes on. Beginning in the early 2000s and accelerating through the 2010s, LSD and related compounds began to reappear in legitimate clinical research settings for the first time in 3 decades, and the results were, to put it mildly, striking. study at Johns Hopkins, NYU, and institutions in Europe began publishing findings on psilocybin's effectiveness in treating depression, addiction, and end-of-life anxiety, echoing and in some cases exceeding the results that had been documented before the research shutdown of 1970. The scientific conversation that had been forcibly interrupted was resuming, with better tools, more rigorous methodology, and a cultural context that made the findings slightly less radioactive than they had been when the counterculture was still a fresh and frightening memory to the people setting policy. But between the shutdown of 1970 and the cautious resumption of the 2000s, the research did not stop entirely. It went underground, continued by a small network of chemists, therapists, and researchers who operated outside institutional frameworks, documenting their findings in publications that circulated within a small community and nowhere else. The most significant figure in this underground period was Alexander Shulgin, a Berkeley-trained pharmacologist who had worked for Dow Chemical before becoming independent and converting his backyard laboratory in Lafayette, California, into one of the most productive psychedelic research facilities that has never appeared in any university catalogue. Shulgin synthesized, characterized, and self-tested hundreds of psychedelic compounds over a period of decades, working with a small group of trusted colleagues and his wife Anne, who co-authored his two major books, Pishkal, Phenethylamines I Have Known and Loved, and Tichkal, Tryptamines I Have Known and Loved, were published in the early 90s, part scientific compendium and part memoir, containing detailed synthesis instructions for dozens of psychoactive compounds alongside personal accounts of their effects. They were not published by academic presses. They were self-published and sold directly. The DEA was not delighted. Shulgin had an unusual arrangement with the DEA, a Schedule I researcher's license that allowed him to work with controlled substances legally, obtained in part through his earlier cooperation with the agency on drug identification cases. The license did not authorize him to synthesize new compounds in the quantities he was producing, a legal ambiguity that the agency eventually resolved in 1994 with a raid on his laboratory, a substantial fine, and the revocation of his license. By then, the books had been published. The information was out. The therapists who continued using MDMA, a compound Shulgin had not invented but had popularized within the therapeutic community in the late 70s, in clinical settings after its scheduling in 1985, operated in a genuine legal grey area, treating patients with a substance that had demonstrated remarkable results in therapeutic contexts and had been scheduled for reasons that had as much to do with its recreational use in nightclubs as with any clinical assessment of its risks. The accounts from these underground therapy sessions, eventually collected and published, documented outcomes that the mainstream psychiatric establishment was, by the early 2000s, beginning to find impossible to ignore. The psychedelic renaissance that began in the 2000s was not a revolution. It was a resumption, the picking up of a thread that had been cut in 1970 by researchers who had read the original literature and concluded that the interruption had been a policy decision, not a scientific one. They were right, and the results they began producing confirmed it. 30 years of suppressed inquiry resolved into a decade of accelerating discovery, and the compounds that had been scheduled as having no medical use began accumulating a body of clinical evidence that challenged that classification with increasing directness. The science had been waiting. The culture slowly was catching up. There is a precise, documentable moment when the counterculture stopped being a counterculture and became a marketing category, and it happened faster than anyone inside the movement expected. By 1969, the imagery, the music, the fashion, and the vocabulary of the hippie movement were already being absorbed into advertising, film, and mainstream retail at a pace that alarmed many of its originators. Department stores were selling love beads, television commercials were using psychedelic visuals, The revolution was being sold back to itself in the form of soft drinks, and the people who had created the aesthetic found themselves in the strange position of watching something they had made become unrecognisable while remaining entirely familiar. This process, which critics within the movement called co-optation, was both commercially successful and philosophically devastating. The speed of the absorption was partly a function of how visually distinctive the counterculture aesthetic was. Psychedelic colours, flowing garments, long hair, and flower imagery were immediately identifiable, which made them powerful community signals within the movement and irresistible raw material for industries that traffic in identity and aspiration. Fashion moved fastest. Within 2 years of the Summer of Love, the silhouettes and fabrics of hippie style were appearing in mainstream department stores and Vogue editorials, stripped of their political content and repackaged as seasonal trends. The young women who had been wearing Indian cotton and hand-dyed fabric as expressions of their rejection of consumer culture watched their aesthetic become a consumer product with a mixture of amusement and fury. The music industry moved almost as quickly. The major labels, initially uncertain what to do with bands that played 40-minute songs and refused to make radio-friendly singles, figured it out by the early 70s. You signed the artists, gave them relatively generous creative control in the short term, and used the cultural capital they generated to sell albums by the millions. Bands that had played free in parks were now selling out arenas. The transaction between art and commerce that the counterculture had been trying to refuse was simply operating at a different scale, and the artists were on the inside of it whether they had intended to be or not. Advertising discovered the counterculture's emotional vocabulary, community, authenticity, liberation, connection, and began deploying it to sell products that had nothing to do with any of these values. The Pepsi Generation campaign of the late 60s, Coca-Cola's I'd Like to Teach the World to Sing, the use of rock music in car commercials, these were not subtle appropriations. They were direct translations of counterculture feeling into sales strategy, and they worked. Because the feelings being invoked were real, and the people being targeted were real people, with real longing for the things the advertisements promised and the products could not deliver. What co-optation did to the counterculture was not destroy it exactly, but hollow it. The aesthetic persisted while the politics dissolved. The look of the thing was retained while the meaning was evacuated. By the mid-70s, you could buy the complete visual vocabulary of the Summer of Love at any shopping mall in America, the incense, the posters, the beads, the bell-bottoms, and encounter none of the communal organizing anti-war politics or genuine alternative economics that had given those objects their original significance. The signifiers floated free of what they had signified. The costume outlasted the conviction. Thomas Frank, writing about this dynamic in The Conquest of Cool decades later, argued that co-optation was not an accident or a failure of the counterculture's defences. It was, he suggested, the natural endpoint of a movement whose critique of mainstream America was primarily aesthetic rather than structural, that a movement which defined its opposition in terms of style was always going to be vulnerable to having its style absorbed. The people who had wanted to change the world got a section of the department store named after them. That is both less and more than nothing, depending on how you hold it. The hippie movement failed, depending on how you define failure, but it also succeeded in ways that are difficult to overstate and easy to overlook. The environmental movement, which now shapes policy, law, and corporate behaviour worldwide, grew directly out of counterculture ecology. The organic food industry, the natural health movement, practices of meditation and yoga that now normalized across American culture, the general expectation that corporations should have some social responsibility, all of these trace partial lineages back to the counterculture's rejection of industrial society. Even the technology revolution that remade the world in the following decades is deeply connected. Many of the founders of the personal computer industry were graduates of the counterculture who believed, entirely sincerely, that access to information was a form of liberation. The environmental legacy is the clearest. The first Earth Day was held in April of 1970, 20 million Americans participating in the largest civic demonstration in American history up to that point, and its organisers drew directly from the networks, the energy, and the communal organising infrastructure that the counterculture had built. The Clean Air Act and the Clean Water Act followed within 2 years. The Environmental Protection Agency was established. These were not small achievements. They were structural legislative changes to the relationship between industrial production and the natural world, achieved through political pressure generated by a movement that had been dismissed as naive and impractical. The rivers stopped catching fire. That is a measurable outcome. The organic food movement grew from the communes outward. Farms that had been established as experiments in alternative living developed agricultural practices that the mainstream food system would not adopt for decades, and the markets and cooperatives that distributed their products became the seed of an industry now worth hundreds of billions of dollars annually. The Whole Earth catalogue, published by Stuart Brand beginning in 1968, was a kind of practical encyclopedia for people trying to live differently, listing tools, seeds, books, and resources for self-sufficient living, and it functioned as both a commune supply guide and a prototype for the kind of curated information aggregation that the internet would make universal. The technology connection runs deeper than most people recognize. Stuart Brand went on to found the Whole Earth electronic link, one of the first online communities in 1985. Steve Jobs spoke openly about his LSD use and his time at Hippie commune in Oregon as formative experiences in his development as a designer and thinker. The personal computer culture that developed in the Bay Area in the 1970s drew extensively on the counterculture's ethos of individual empowerment through tools, the idea, explicit in Brand's work, that a well-designed instrument in individual hands could disrupt the monopoly of centralized institutions. What the counterculture changed most durably was the relationship between individuals and institutions in American culture, the default level of deference that ordinary people extended to authority in government, medicine, education, and corporate life. Before the 60s, the standard posture was compliance. After them, it was skepticism. You were allowed to question your doctor, your government, your employer, your church. Not just allowed, expected to. The presumption of institutional good faith that had characterized the 1950s was gone, replaced by a demand for accountability that has shaped American public life ever since. The movement also failed in ways that mattered. It did not end racism. It did not dismantle the economic structures that concentrated wealth at the top. It did not stop American military adventurism, which continued through the decades after Vietnam with depressing regularity. The consciousness it raised was real and insufficient simultaneously. Changing how people feel about the world is necessary, but not sufficient for changing how the world is organized. The 60s learned that lesson expensively, and the lesson has had to be relearned at intervals since. Beginning in the early 2000s and accelerating through the 2010s, LSD and related compounds began to reappear in legitimate clinical research settings for the first time in 3 decades, and the results were, to put it mildly, striking. Studies at Johns Hopkins, NYU, and institutions in Europe began publishing findings on psilocybin's effectiveness in treating depression, addiction, and end-of-life anxiety, echoing and in some cases exceeding the results that had been documented before the research shutdown of 1970. The scientific conversation that had been forcibly interrupted was resuming, with better tools, more rigorous methodology, and a cultural context that made the findings slightly less radioactive than they had been when the counterculture was still a fresh and frightening memory to the people setting policy. The Johns Hopkins studies, led by Roland Griffiths beginning in 2006, were the first rigorously designed clinical trials of a psychedelic compound in the United States since the early 1970s. They used psilocybin rather than LSD, partly because psilocybin carried slightly less regulatory and cultural baggage, and their findings were published in Psychopharmacology, a peer-reviewed journal, which meant they had to survive the scrutiny of other scientists before the world was allowed to read them. The findings were that psilocybin produced mystical-type experiences of remarkable consistency and intensity in healthy volunteers, and that those experiences produced lasting positive changes in mood, behaviour, and reported quality of life that were still measurable a year later. The mainstream psychiatric establishment read these findings with a mixture of interest and the specific discomfort of people who had been telling a story about a subject for 30 years and were now being asked to reconsider it. The MD research that had been suppressed since 1985 was also resuming, primarily through the work of MAPS, the Multidisciplinary Association for Psychedelic Studies, a non-profit organisation founded in 1986 specifically to push for the clinical research that scheduling had shut down. Their MDMA-assisted therapy trials for post-traumatic stress disorder, begun in the early 2000s and continuing through Phase 3 clinical trials, produced results so striking that the FDA granted MDMA, Assisted Therapy Breakthrough Therapy designation in 2017, a status reserved for treatments that show substantial improvement over existing options in serious conditions. The compound that had been classified as having no medical use was, 40 years later, being fast-tracked toward approval as a treatment for one of the most treatment-resistant psychiatric conditions in modern medicine. The cultural context for this renaissance was different from 1967 in important ways. The researchers involved were careful, almost conspicuously careful, to distance themselves from the counterculture's associations, to present their work in the language of rigorous science rather than consciousness expansion, to emphasize clinical outcomes rather than spiritual experiences, to avoid the kind of public advocacy that had made Timothy Leary such a useful target. They were doing what the original researchers had been doing before Leary made the whole enterprise politically impossible, and they understood that maintaining scientific credibility required not repeating his mistakes. The popular press discovered the Renaissance in the mid-2000s, and the coverage that followed was, by the standards of earlier psychedelic journalism, remarkably measured. Books like Michael Pollan's How to Change Your Mind, published in 2018, brought the clinical research to a mainstream audience with a journalist's care for evidence and a novelist's attention to experience. The story Pollan told was not the story of the 60s, it was the story of a scientific inquiry that had been interrupted for political reasons and was now resuming, with findings that deserved serious attention. It was read by millions of people, many of them middle-aged professionals who had never taken a psychedelic in their lives, and it changed the cultural conversation about these compounds in ways that the counterculture, for all its noise, had not managed to do. The people who had built the counterculture from the inside grew older, as people do, and what happened to them afterward is one of the more interesting and varied stories in the history of any social movement. Some made it through the 70s and built lives that incorporated the values they had lived experimentally, working in alternative education, environmental activism, holistic medicine, community building. Some did not make it through the casualty rate from hard drugs, which followed psychedelics into the counterculture's infrastructure in the late 60s with considerably less philosophical packaging and considerably more destructive power, was significant. Some became exactly the kind of people they had set out to oppose, which is the kind of irony that tends to make its way into memoir, and some simply kept going, carrying whatever was still alive from the original vision into the next decade and the one after that. Ken Kesey returned to Oregon, bought a farm, raised his family, and wrote 2 more novels that were admired without achieving the cultural impact of Cuckoo's Nest. He remained a genuine original, funny, warm, intellectually restless, the kind of man who filled a room without trying to, and he died in 2001 of liver cancer, having spent the intervening decades as a farmer, writer, occasional public figure, and irreplaceable presence in the lives of the people who knew him. The bus further was restored multiple times, and is still occasionally driven in public appearances by members of his family. It still says "Caution," weird load on the back, which remains accurate. Peter Coyote, the digger who became an actor, worked steadily in film and television for decades while continuing to write and speak about the 60s with an intelligence and honesty that the documentary record of the era consistently rewards. His memoir, Sleeping Where I Fall, published in 1998, is one of the most clear-eyed accounts of the counterculture's idealism and its failures written by anyone who was at the centre of it. He did not romanticize. He did not apologize. He told it as it was, which turned out to be complicated enough to be interesting. Richard Alpert, Leary's Harvard colleague, travelled to India in 1967, met a guru in the Himalayas who renamed him Ram Dass, and returned to America as a spiritual teacher whose book Be Here Now, published in 1971, became one of the best-selling books of the decade, and introduced Eastern meditation practices to an audience that the counterculture had prepared and the religious mainstream had not served. He had a stroke in 1997 that left him with expressive aphasia, and spent the last decades of his life on Maui, teaching, writing, and demonstrating with considerable grace that the things he'd been saying about presence and impermanence were not just philosophy. The heroin casualties were real and numerous. Janis Joplin, 27, October of 1970. Jimi Hendrix, 27, September of 1970. Jim Morrison, 27, July of 1971. The cluster of deaths at the same age in the same year produced a mythology of its own, the 27 Club, that tends to obscure the broader pattern of substance-related deaths that extended through the community and continued into the 70s and beyond, taking people who were less famous but equally mourned by the people who loved them. What the survivors carried forward was not a unified ideology or a coherent political program. It was something more diffuse and more durable, a set of questions about how to live, about what community means, about the relationship between individual consciousness and collective action, that had been asked with unusual urgency during a particular decade and had not been satisfactorily answered. The people who had asked them most seriously spent their remaining years living with the questions, which is perhaps the most honest thing you can do with a question that does not resolve. The 1960s, and the Summer of Love in particular, have been mythologized to a degree that makes the actual historical record somewhat difficult to see clearly, because the myth is so much cleaner than the reality and so much easier to sell. In the myth, the hippies were right about everything, and the only thing that stopped them from succeeding was the government, the corporations, and human weakness. In the reality, the movement contained genuine idealism and genuine corruption, remarkable creativity and profound naivety, a vision of human possibility that remains compelling, and a set of tools for achieving it that were frequently inadequate. The most honest thing you can say about it is that it was full of contradictions. Like every movement, like every generation, like every human being who ever tried to make the world a little more like the one they had imagined while lying in the dark, listening to music, and briefly believing that change was not only possible but inevitable. The myth serves a purpose, which is why it persists. Every generation needs a story about the last time someone tried seriously to change everything, and the 60s occupy that. roll in the American cultural imagination with a vividness that later movements have not displaced. The images are too good. The flowers in the rifle barrels, the 500,000 people in the mud at Woodstock, the painted bus moving through the desert with the speakers blasting, and the music is too powerful, and the biographical arc of the era has the shape of a story. Idealism, crisis, betrayal, loss. It is a story about what it costs to believe in something, and it is told so well because the people who lived it were, by and large, exceptionally good at narrating their own experience. What the mythology tends to erase is the work, the unglamorous, exhausting daily labour of the people who kept the digger kitchens running, and the free clinics staffed, and the underground press printed, and the commune fields planted, who got up every morning in difficult circumstances and chose, again, to show up. The people who appear in the photographs and the documentaries are not always the people who did that work, and the people who did the work are not always easy to find in the historical record. They are there, if you look, in the community newsletters and the oral histories and the interviews that no one major publication ran. They built things that mattered. Most of them never expected to be famous for it. The LSD dimension of the story is particularly vulnerable to mythologization in both directions, either romanticized as the key to a lost golden age of consciousness or demonized as the solvent that dissolved the social fabric. The chemical itself was neither of these things. It was a powerful tool that produced extraordinary experiences in some people and terrible experiences in others, that opened some minds and destabilized others, that contributed to genuine insight and genuine damage in roughly unpredictable proportions. That is not a satisfying conclusion for people who need LSD to be either the hero or the villain of the story, which is why neither version of the myth lets it be complicated. What the 60s left behind, stripped of myth in both directions, is a series of genuine questions that American society has been arguing about ever since, about the proper relationship between individual freedom and collective responsibility, about who bears the cost of social change and who collects the benefits, about what consciousness is and whether it can be deliberately expanded and whether that expansion is good, about how you build community in a society organized around competition. These are not settled questions. They are the questions that every generation has to engage with in its own terms, using whatever tools are available, making whatever mistakes its particular blind spots produce. The people who took LSD in 1967 and lay in Golden Gate Park staring at the sky and believing they had understood something enormous were not wrong that they had understood something. They were sometimes wrong about what it was. The understanding and the misunderstanding came packaged together, as they tend to do, and the work of the half-century since has been to sort through the package carefully, keep what was real, and set down, gently, what was wishful. That work is not finished. It may be the kind of work that is never finished. And tonight, lying in the dark with the fan running and the lights down low, that is perhaps a comforting thought, that the questions worth asking stay open, that the search continues, and that somewhere out there another generation is lying on its back looking up at something vast and wondering, with the particular hopefulness of the young, whether they might be the ones who finally figure it out, and so here you are, still breathing, still warm, tucked into whatever corner of the world you've made comfortable for yourself tonight, while outside the ordinary machinery of modern life hums along in the dark, the refrigerator keeping things cold, the heating keeping things warm, the tap producing clean water at the exact temperature you prefer, none of which requires a prayer, a fire, or a particularly cooperative goat. Tonight you travelled a long way. You stood in a Swiss laboratory in 1943 and watched a chemist get on his bicycle, not knowing he was about to become a footnote that changed history. You walked through a neighbourhood in San Francisco that briefly believed it was inventing a new way of being human, and watched it fill up with hope and hunger in roughly equal measure. You sat in the mud at Woodstock and heard the music carry something across the air that was larger than any song. You watched a generation ask enormous questions out loud, in public, at considerable personal cost, and get some of the answers badly wrong and some of them quietly and lastingly right. These were real people, messy, contradictory, sometimes ridiculous, often brave, frequently confused about the difference between a vision and a plan. They were your age, or your parents' age, or your grandparents' age, lying in parks and commune kitchens and borrowed living rooms, passing things hand to hand, a record, a newspaper, a bowl of free soup, a small square of paper that promised to show them something they had never seen, and trying, with the tools available to them and the blind spots they could not see past, to make the world a little more like the one they had imagined. They did not finish the job, no generation does, but the environmental laws that keep your air breathable, the organic food on your grocery store shelf, the yoga class on your phone, the clinical trials quietly restoring decades of suppressed research, the basic cultural permission to question authority rather than simply accept it. These are things they left behind, imperfect and partial and real. So tonight, as you let the last of this settle and feel the weight of your own comfortable bed doing its quiet work, maybe spare a thought for Albert Hoffman's cycling home, through Basel with the universe rearranging itself around him, for the diggers hauling pots of soup to a park full of strangers, for the doctors at the free clinic talking someone through a bad night with nothing but patience and a calm voice, for the musicians who played for free in the afternoon because the neighbourhood needed music and they had music to give. They were stubborn, those people, idealistic past the point of practicality sometimes, but also genuinely, stubbornly, defiantly hopeful in ways that the world keeps needing and keeps running short of. Rest now. The questions will still be there in the morning, so will you.